Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Imagine a brilliant medical breakthrough happens today. Like a massive peer-reviewed study proves that a new protocol can cut hospital infection rates in half. It literally saves lives.
Right.
So when do you think that protocol will actually reach a patient's bedside? Tomorrow. Maybe next month. Try 15 to 17 years.
Yeah, it's an absolute failure of the system. I mean, a life-saving practice that was discovered when you were in kindergarten might just be making its way onto the hospital floor the exact day you graduate.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
And that unacceptable delay is exactly why we are here today. So welcome to this custom deep dive. If you're listening to this, you're likely a nursing or health sciences student, and we are just so thrilled you're tuning in.
Absolutely.
Consider this your one-on-one tutoring session, because our mission today is to completely unpack Chapter 9 of your textbook, Evidence-Based Practice in Nursing and Healthcare.
Specifically the 5th edition, right?
Right, the 5th edition.
Yeah.
And we are focusing strictly on key strategies for implementing evidence in real-world clinical settings. So, let's unpack this. We're going to guide you through the material in the exact order it appears in the text. So you aren't just prepped for your exams, but completely ready for the reality of clinical practice.
Because the reality you are about to step into is, well, it's complicated. Knowing the best medical practice is only half the battle. Actually, getting a hospital to implement it, that's an entirely different war.
Yeah, completely. So let's start with the foundation. We hear terms like evidence-based practice or EBP and evidence-based decision-making, EBDM, all the time. But functionally, what are we talking about here?
So functionally, EDP and EBDM are efficient problem-solving approaches.
Okay.
They are methodologies where you use the absolute best current evidence to drive healthcare decisions. And this isn't just an academic exercise either. EBP is the required foundation for achieving what the industry calls the quadruple aim.
Right, the quadruple aim. I want to make sure we ground that in reality.
Yeah.
It's essentially the holy grail for a hospital.
Exactly. Aim number 1 is improving the patient experience. So, meaning the care is high quality and it's safe. Aim number 2 is enhancing overall population health outcomes.
Makes sense.
Aim number 3 is reducing healthcare costs because, wasteful care just bankrupts systems. And aim number 4, which should matter a lot to you as a future clinician, is empowering the staff and improving clinician well-being.
So it actually helps the nurses themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Hospitals that do EBP right actually have lower burnout rates. It hits all 4 of those targets.
Wow. So if it achieves the holy grail, why on earth is there a 15-year delay?
Yeah, that's the big question.
I like to think of this problem using a restaurant analogy. EBP essentially happens in 2 phases. Phase 1 is like developing the perfect, scientifically proven, award-winning recipe. You do the research, you find exactly what works.
Right, you get the best practice recommendation.
Exactly. But phase 2, that's trying to get a massive, chaotic, high-stress kitchen with 100 different cooks to prepare that exact recipe perfectly every single night for every single customer. Phase 1 is figuring out the practice. Phase 2 is implementing and sustaining it.
And phase 2 is where hospitals completely fall apart. You can have the best recipe in the world, but if the kitchen culture is toxic or, they don't have the right equipment, the food will still be terrible.
Yeah.
Implementation of EBP is only possible when an organization has the right culture and the actual readiness to change. And we have to assess both of those things.
But how do you even measure something as invisible as culture or readiness? It's not like taking a patient's temperature.
Actually, there is a tool that functions exactly like an organizational thermometer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's an assessment tool called the OCRC. Essentially, it measures both the culture of the hospital and its readiness for system-wide implementation at the same time. You deploy this assessment to see if the hospital is actually capable of surviving phase 2.
Okay, gotcha. And when we talk about readiness, your textbook highlights 4 specific pillars a hospital must have to be considered ready. First, they need empowered nurses and clinicians who actually have the authority to drive change.
Right, without authority, nothing happens.
Exactly. Second, they need purposeful hands-on EBP training, because what you learn in school is just the primer, right? You need ongoing skills building on the job.
Yeah.
Third is equipment and access. You can't ask a nurse to research best practices if they don't have access to computers, databases, or point-of-care mentors.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how often that happens.
I bet. And fourth, you need supportive leadership that actually carves out protected time for this work.
Yeah. And if you are missing even one of those 4 pillars, your readiness just collapses.
So, okay, if hospitals have this thermometer tool, the OCSEEP, and they know the 4 pillars they need, why do so many organizations fail at this readiness stage? Are they just, lazy?
Not lazy, just completely misdirected. The biggest reason organizations fail at the readiness stage is that they confuse EBP with other types of data or evidence use.
Interesting.
They throw millions of dollars and hundreds of working hours into the wrong domains, thinking they're doing EBP when they just aren't.
Okay, that confuses me a bit. Because if a hospital has a massive quality improvement department, aren't they automatically doing evidence-based practice?
No, and it is a very dangerous misconception to think they are the same thing.
Oh, wow.
To clear this up, let's draw a strict line between the 4 unique domains of evidence mentioned in your text. First, you have research. Think of research as inventing a brand new tool in a laboratory. It generates entirely new knowledge.
Okay, inventing the tool.
Got it. Second, you have process improvement, or PI, which is what most quality improvement departments do. This is about making your factory run smoothly. It's streamlining operations and reducing waste.
Like the methodologies mentioned in the book.
Exactly. Things like PDSA Cycles Plan to Study Act, or Six Sigma, which is about minimizing waste and increasing financial stability, and Lean, which is about removing non-value added activities.
Okay.
Those are great for saving money, but they are focused on internal processes, not necessarily clinical science.
So where does EBP actually fit in that?
EBP is the third domain. EBP isn't inventing a new tool, and it isn't just making the factory run faster. EBP is searching the entire world of existing literature, synthesizing the absolute best current evidence, and using it for your specific patient.
Right.
And just to complete the list, the 4th domain is innovation, which is creating a completely novel solution when one doesn't exist at all, or modifying an existing one.
Okay, so let me make sure I have this straight. If a hospital is just streamlining a bad, outdated nursing process so it runs faster, they are doing quality improvement, but they're absolutely not doing EBP.
Exactly. For quality improvement to actually deliver true quality, it must be evidence-based QI.
That makes total sense. And your textbook has a flowchart for this called the alignment model, specifically figure 9.2. And I think the best way to visualize it is like a giant hospital triage funnel for problems.
Right.
A funnel. So a question drops into the top. Maybe it's a clinical issue, maybe an organizational or performance metric. It enters the funnel, which is the EBP process. And at the bottom, the first thing you ask is, do we have sufficient evidence to solve this?
Yes. And if the answer is yes, you have sufficient evidence, it flows out to the left into implement evidence-based change.
But if the answer is no, you have insufficient evidence, it flows to the right. You either have to conduct research to find the answer, or you branch off into innovation to invent a solution.
Precisely. And critically, no matter which path you take out of that funnel, everything at the bottom is wrapped in a continuous circle of quality improvement to monitor the results.
Okay, so we have the theory down. We know the domains. We know the triage flow and the alignment model. Let's talk about the roadblocks. Because when you, the listener, step onto the floor, you're going to hit some massive walls.
You are. And what's fascinating here is that the most prevalent barrier is deeply ironic. It's often the nurse leaders themselves.
Wait, really? Leadership?
Yeah. Studies show that many chief nurse executives report EBP as a low priority while simultaneously claiming quality and safety are their top priorities.
But we just established that EBP is the literal mechanism to achieve quality and safety. How can a chief nurse miss that?
Because they erroneously view EBP as an outcome. They think of it as a destination rather than understanding it as the methodology you use to travel there. And because of this blind spot at the top, EBP doesn't get funded. Managers resist it because they think it's just another secondary project.
Rather than the core way they should be operating.
Exactly.
And when leadership doesn't support the methodology, it breeds a toxic culture of tradition. Clinical practice becomes dictated by provider preference or, the most dangerous phrase in medicine. We've always done it this way. We see this manifest in what I call the 3-year policy trap.
Oh, yes. The 3-year policy trap is a massive cultural red flag. In a lot of hospitals, clinical policies are arbitrarily scheduled for review every 3 years. But instead of conducting a rigorous literature search to see what new evidence has emerged,
they just sit in a room.
Right. A committee just sits around a table, glances at the old policy, says, yep, this is still what we do, and they just rubber stamp it.
They are essentially institutionalizing highly variable, outdated care, which is the enemy of highly reliable care. They rely on brainstorming in meetings rather than systematic problem-solving with PICOT questions and clinical inquiry.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the most heartbreaking barrier and the one that will affect our listener directly.
Yeah.
The lack of clinician competency, which leads to the preceptor problem.
Yeah, this is where that 15 to 17-year gap becomes a harsh reality on the floor.
Let's paint a picture of how this happens. Let's say we have an eager new nursing grad. Let's call her Sarah. So Sarah just graduated. She read Chapter 9. She's ready, and she's assigned to a busy med-surg floor. She encounters a patient with a specific type of wound, and she knows from her recent EBP training that there is a highly effective modern protocol for addressing it.
Right. She knows the best evidence.
Exactly. So she brings it up to her preceptor, a veteran nurse who's been there for 20 years. But the preceptor shuts her down and says, "We don't have time for that, Sarah. Here is how we've always dressed that wound on this unit."
And right there, Sarah has a choice. She can fight her preceptor and risk failing her orientation, or she can conform.
And almost always the new nurse conforms. Sarah abandons her EBP training just to survive the social pressure of her unit. The preceptor effectively extinguishes Sarah's spirit of inquiry.
Which is step 0 of the entire EBP process.
Right. If you kill the spirit of inquiry on day 1, that nurse might spend the next 30 years practicing non-evidence-based care.
It is a systemic tragedy. And because these cultural barriers are so deeply entrenched, we can't just hope things get better organically. We actually rely on an entire scientific field dedicated to breaking those barriers down. It's called implementation science.
Implementation science. So this is the field trying to shrink that unacceptable 15 to 17-year delay.
Precisely. Implementation science, or AS, studies how to translate evidence into practice. It's the science of making evidence stick. For example, your text mentions a massive initiative called the ARCC project.
The ARCC project, right.
Yeah, the researchers compiled 73 specific evidence-based implementation strategies. The point is, leaders shouldn't just sit in a boardroom and brainstorm how to roll out a new protocol. They should use scientifically proven methods to implement the evidence.
I love how meta that is. Using evidence-based strategies to implement evidence-based practice.
Exactly. And for this to work, hospital leaders have to get their hands dirty. They have to literally embed EBP into the organization's vision and mission statements. They also have to embrace transdisciplinary care.
Transdisciplinary care. That means intentional interprofessional teams.
Right. You don't just have the nurses siloed over here, the pharmacists over there, and the physical therapists down the hall. You break the silos. Furthermore, leaders have to directly deal with what the textbook calls laggards.
The people who actively resist change.
Yes, out of fear or stubbornness. You can't ignore them. Leaders must have direct conversations to move them forward.
But the chief nursing executive can't be everywhere at once. They need boots on the ground to deal with the laggards and to protect new nurses like Sarah. They need EBP mentors.
Yes. The capacity for EVP doesn't naturally exist in a hospital. It has to be deliberately built. Organizations need a critical mass of EBP mentors right there on the clinical floor. And these mentors need intensive training not just in EBP, but in behavioral and organizational change.
And building that army of mentors costs money.
It does.
Which is why leaders must be financial advocates.
Yeah.
They have to measure and prove the return on investment, the ROI of EBP to the hospital executives.
Yeah.
Like, look, we spent $50,000 training mentors, but we saved $500,000 in reduced patient readmissions.
Exactly. You have to speak their language.
Right. They also need to utilize shared governance councils and weave EBT language into everyday operations. Put it in the job descriptions, tie it to performance reviews, build it into clinical career ladders.
If you make it inescapable, it becomes the culture.
Okay, so how does a hospital actually organize all of this? I mean, is there a blueprint for the executives to follow?
There is, but to understand the blueprint, we first have to clarify the difference between two types of models used in healthcare. First, you have process models, like the Iowa model or the Johns Hopkins model. A process model is like a map for a single road trip. It guides the specific step-by-step process of doing one EBP project. But then you have organizational models. These guide system-wide implementation.
Okay, so process is for the project, organizational is for the whole system.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Your textbook highlights Figure 9.1, which is the ARCC Model Advancing Research and Clinical Practice through Close Collaboration. Let's walk through the visual flow of how this blueprint actually functions.
It follows a highly logical flow. Step 1 of the ARCC model is assessment. You deploy that organizational thermometer we talked about, the OCR-SEEP, to measure the culture and readiness for EBP.
Okay, so you take the temperature. Step 1, then what?
Step 2 is identification. Based on those results, you identify your specific strengths, maybe a supportive culture, and your barriers, like a lack of EBP mentors.
Which naturally triggers Step 3, the use of EBP mentors to implement RSC strategies. This is where mentors host interactive skills-building workshops to tackle the barriers head-on.
Exactly. And Step 4 is the result of that. As those mentors work with the staff, it creates a shift. It leads to increased EBP belief, knowledge, and competency among the clinicians.
Let me make sure I follow the arrows here. You assess the culture, identify the roadblocks, deploy mentors to clear them, which builds competency. And that leads to Step 5, the outcomes.
It does. The final stage hits those quadruple aim outcomes we started with. For the staff, following the arrows, this results in high job satisfaction and less turnover. And for the hospital, it leads to improved healthcare quality and safety and decreased costs.
It's a fantastic overarching model. But, now that our listener understands the big picture, I want to talk about the tactical tools. What does a clinician actually hold in their hands on the floor to make this happen?
For the day-to-day tactical work, we rely on implementation toolkits. A toolkit is an evidence-based bundle of resources. It includes things like implementation checklists, communication plans, educational materials, you name it. Your textbook highlights the full ARCC EBP toolkit, emphasizing its 5 specific checkpoints.
Okay, let me push back on this for a second. If a toolkit is so great, why can't a hospital administrator just email the PDF of the toolkit to everyone, tell them to read it, and be done?
Because toolkits are a passive strategy. An email doesn't change behavior. A checklist doesn't confront a laggard. Toolkits absolutely require an EBP mentor and an executive sponsor to actually work. Specifically, you need human beings to enforce the final, most critical checkpoint of the full toolkit: sustainability and intentional reassessment.
Right, because without a mentor ensuring the change is sustained, the staff will revert back to their old habits within a month.
Exactly.
And you also need a way to measure if your staff is actually capable of using these tools. I mean, you can't just guess if a nurse is competent.
Right. That's why we have the EBP competencies. There are 24 specific, measurable competencies outlined, 13 baseline skills for all registered nurses, and 11 additional advanced skills for APNs, advanced practice nurses. Organizations use these to measure performance and guide employee orientation.
To pull all of this together, Table 9.1 provides a comprehensive 12-step strategy for real-world application. It's essentially the ultimate cheat sheet. Let's summarize it so our listener can really grasp how a nurse experiences this transformation.
That's a great idea. Step 1 is to assess culture and readiness.
Step 2, build EBP into the mission. Step 3, appoint a director of EBP. Step 4, allocate resources.
Right, so those first 4 are all about prepping the environment. Then Step 5 is train the leaders, make them walk the talk. Step 6, set expectations for new hires. Step 7, train the clinicians. Step 8, develop EBP mentors.
And Step 9, update policy manuals with actual evidence. Let's end that 3-year rubber stamp trap.
Yes. Then the final phase, Step 10, measure outcomes to prove the ROI. Step 11, disseminate outcomes. You have to share the knowledge internally and externally. And Step 12, recognize and reward EBP champions.
It is a complete life cycle. But, beyond all these models and the 12 steps, we need to talk directly to you, the listener, because at the end of the day, EBP is a personal responsibility.
It is. Healthcare professionals have a social contract with the public to be lifelong learners. Patients trust you with their lives under the assumption that you are providing the best possible care, not just the care that was popular 10 years ago, which means you have a professional duty. If you are competent in EBP, you must mentor others. And if you aren't competent yet, you must learn.
Well said. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you prepare for your career. When you step onto the floor as a new graduate, you will encounter outdated policies. You will encounter laggard preceptors who tell you, we've always done it this way, and expect you to conform.
It's inevitable.
It is. Now that you know about the ARCC model, the crucial role of mentors, and that terrifying 15-year gap between research and practice, how will you find your innovators and early adopters to protect your spirit of inquiry?
Because protecting your curiosity is the only way you survive phase 2. It's the only way we keep that 15-year gap from turning into a 30-year gap.
You don't want to be the bottleneck in the system. You want to be the one serving up that perfect, scientifically proven care to your patients. Thank you for joining us, and a warm thank you for the Last Minute Lecture team. Good luck on your clinicals.